Welcome back to the Legacy of Love podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Eckline, and today I'm so excited to be joined by Emily Bouchard. I think she's a true unicorn, and she is an expert in navigating the complex intersection of love and money within families. So, with over 20 years of experience, Emily has dedicated her career to helping families communicate more effectively, making decisions with greater ease, and tackling challenges ranging from step family dynamics and family governance to business succession and purposeful prenuptial planning. She's the author of Estate Planning for Blended Families and The Beginner's Guide to Purposeful Prenups. And she has brought so much wisdom and knowledge from her background and work as a fractional chief learning officer. So when Emily isn't traveling to lead family meetings or speaking engagements, you can find her on her 10-acre ranch with 9 horses where she facilitates transformative retreats. I'm telling you, she's a true unicorn. So get ready for this powerful conversation filled with insights from Emily and some strategies and even a few stories about transformation and really how we can create more connection, find more clarity and collaboration across generations. Talk about leaving a legacy of love. Emily is really the expert here, and I just am so grateful to have her come on. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as we did. Emily Bouchard, welcome to the Legacy of Love podcast. I'm so happy you're here with me.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, Emily, as we start off the conversation, I would love for listeners to hear a bit about what brought you to the important work you're doing, to having this consulting business that honestly just you seem like a bit of a unicorn. So I'm sure there's an interesting story there.
Oh, well, thanks. I did not come to this through some sort of direct path for sure. I became really interested in families and family dynamics through a personal loss in terms of my mother passing away quite suddenly when I was 14. So it was obviously like an earthquake in my family system. And
There's
I don't know if it was a coping mechanism or how I'm wired, but I just observed a lot in terms of how people were relating, were not relating, what was being said, what wasn't being said, and then also being acutely, painfully aware of what happens when you don't say what is in your heart and in your mind because of how short and precious life is. So that sent me on a trajectory that has led me to here. And it was not something that was planned. And it's all just unfolded in a really beautiful and kind of surprising way. So that's the seminal event that kicked it off.
wow. And that really, I think, especially for this conversation, this is so much of why I love to have conversations like these. It's because our time is so precious. And, I think most of the world is living their day-to-day lives not really connected to that truth that really at any moment we can be gone. And I think that's really the preciousness of this life is that the closer and the more present and aware we are of our own death and those around us, the more that that can really bring into focus, life.
Yeah, there's one of my favorite books is Tuesdays with Morrie. And it's such a beautiful book, Mitch Albom. And
Yeah.
that's the main premise of it, is that when you really come to peace with the fact that you're mortal and you're going to die, you really do start living from a place of intentionality and to have those conversations that matter. And, I think a lot about your role and like, what does it mean to be a trustee and how trusted you are to hold and carry for somebody their wishes if they're not there to do it themselves. And I don't know how many trustees really get how fraught that is, like why it's so hard for people to make that decision or like oftentimes going without signing estate planning documents. I mean, when I wrote the estate planning for the blended family with Paul Hood, we have at the beginning of the book 11 fears that people have that keep them from doing their estate plan. Because as you know, there's the vast majority of people don't even have a will. And
Yeah.
just the facing our mortality is a very painful thing if you don't feel like you're living your life with that kind of intentionality.
And I'm assuming that's one of the fears.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. I know. I
yeah.
feel like estate planning, it's like the perfect storm as much as it's and so much of why I have this podcast is to help reach people and really get the importance. I also, the more that I think I lean in and have the conversations, I see why most people don't, because it really requires us to be willing to kind of go that, make the extra effort and also have this dialogue within ourselves about, like we were talking about death, but also our relationship to money.
It's interesting. I was thinking about activity that I often do with families. Once we've established a lot of trust and they know they can trust me to facilitate the conversation well, I'll have all the family members in the room, the parents, the next gen, their spouses, grandkids, even the 16 and older, and we'll do like a fire drill. We'll have like some sort of kind of like absurd scenario. So there is that sense of like
Silliness.
distance and silliness.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
your parents were off on a crazy safari in Africa and they got, attacked by these elephants and like they're in a coma over there and they've been bitten by these numbugs or so they can't talk in the room and the family has to like, oh, who has the information and who has the power of attorney and who what is the medical information? So like they start to think about like, wait, what do we need to know? Who do we call? What and then they start thinking about it that way, but the parents are still alive. And then the parents slowly get killed off one after the other, and they have to regroup and think like, what are their wishes? And we ask all kinds of questions on all these different levels. And the parents are there witnessing how the family struggles with this, and they can't answer anything, they can't say anything. They just get to observe it. And the family really gets this sense of either a lot of vulnerability in terms of, oh, wow, there's only one person within the whole family unit that knows any of this information at all, other than our parents, or none of us know what our parents' wishes are. We need to know that. And then it also helps create like a level playing field, like, oh, we've got some work to do. And of all the things we talked about, what are the most important pressing things? Like if heaven forbid something did happen on the way home tonight. Like so being willing to
Wow.
have that and dive into that, it's so powerful for families, especially when they have multiple properties and multiple businesses. And maybe they've already set up some trusts, but some of the family members understand them and other people don't. And why did the parents set them up that way? And what were the hopes for them? And what are the expectations? And that sort of thing.
Wow. I haven't heard anyone doing kind of this like fire drill, but I love that. I think that's really an important piece. And that's so much of, again, where I see, downstream, once you are administering a state, I mean, typically, especially for my active cases now, so that's where I'm wearing the role as a trustee. A lot of times for those cases, why a professional is needed is a neutral party's needed. And so, like, the family member was acting and either things didn't go according to plans. Unfortunately, there's the worst case scenarios where there was really like a breach of fiduciary duty. So whether it's funds stolen or just things not being tended to, or ultimately people's wishes not being honored. And unfortunately, there are those bad actors.
That's like the extreme, right? There are
Yeah.
people like that. But then
Yeah.
there's this whole gray area in terms of family members that find themselves in a role that they never were adequately prepared for. And they may inadvertently do some things in terms of thinking it would be all right to use the money in certain ways when it was. Like there can be some gray areas. And
Oh,
then
it's mostly gray. And I think that that's again where, having conversations like this helps paint a picture for people because even if we do have conversations, even just like the conversation about like incapacity. I think most people, when they envision kind of what that future is going to look like, they think incapacity is going to be like an on and off switch, or even like death, like, oh, I'm just going to be alive and then one day I'm going to die. Most times, and most of the times when I'm working with clients, I'm working alongside them. Sometimes it's months, more times it's years. Of course, I'm always trying to include my clients as much as possible, but when we have diagnoses like dementia and such, and capacities in question, it's always kind of ever changing and evolving. And sometimes people do kind of get better and we can include them more, but more often than not, it's a slow, subtle decline. So I think the gray area that resonates on so many levels, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you highlight there is the issue of trustee fatigue that can happen. I
Yeah.
worked with one client, oh, so dear. Her accountant referred her to me. She was a second wife of a gentleman, and he thought he had everything in place that would take care of her, but then he got dementia and he was long-term alive and in care. And the trustee that he put in place got fatigued because the gentleman's son was very resentful of how the stepmother was.
Managing things.
It wasn't even that she was managing it, but that she was benefiting in different ways. And he felt that it was unfair and the communication hadn't been done in a way that made sense with the idea of what if there's a long, protracted illness. And as a result, the son ended up being able to take over trusteeship and then cut off his stepmother from the kind of unbridled spending she'd been able to have, and she had to completely adjust her lifestyle. And so I came in to help her manage the emotion around it and also create a life that would work for her within the constraints of the new budget that she was in.
Wow.
And that's just an example of what can happen if you don't really think through all the different possible scenarios.
Wow, what an amazing service you have. So, can you give another example? Because again, with you being the unicorn, I feel like we serve clients in similar ways, but also very different ways. So, maybe just like
Yeah.
an example of if it's one
Yeah.
or two, if there's a model client for a way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about I my specialty is really complex family dynamics. So I have a social work background and I really understand what happens for families when there are significant factors impacting them externally, internally, whatever it might be, whatever their challenges are. And I also bring resources and tools and like communication strategies that help families navigate in the best way possible, given all of the different challenges that they're facing. And the whole goal is so that they can flourish and get the benefit of the wealth or the resources that they have and minimize the pitfalls and the downsides that can happen and the litigation that can sometimes happen. I have a large network of advisors and they know about like this specialty and they'll bring me in for intimately touchy situations. Like I had one where a institutional trustee at a large bank
Hmm.
noticed enough problematic things that were happening with the trust based on how the mother was giving money to one of her daughters, that it was a huge red flag and it was impacting their fiduciary responsibility. And so they had me come in to assess the situation and find out it was this truly elder abuse, was what was happening here. And I got a chance to connect with all three of her children, all adults, and then this mother, and the father had passed away. And one of the daughters was financially abusing the mom. And the other two siblings were very supportive and helpful of looking at how to get a new trustee that was specialist in oppositional beneficiaries, which is quite the subspecialty.
Yeah, there's a few professional fiduciaries that I know of, but that's definitely not my area
Oh,
of
no.
expertise. Yeah.
And so that the mother's lifestyle could be sustained and that the finances wouldn't be drained, but the mom still had a sense of some independence and
Mhm.
self-efficacy, but there's no way that she could continue to write checks to her daughter. So that was a big deal. We had to do a lot of things with an attorney present, with all sort to really assess the situation and bring in my expertise and the expertise of others to protect the mom. So that's one example. And then there's, I think the most common one is when you have a blended family situation, like a step family, where maybe the dad is parent to all four of his children. And he had a first wife that was parent to two, and he has a current wife that's parent to two. And he wants to treat all of his four children equally in their estate. And the stepmom wants to treat her two children fairly because the other two children have a mom with an estate that her kids don't benefit from. And she thought it should be treated differently. And they could not come to an agreement, and they weren't signing their documents, and
Wow.
his health was not the greatest. And so the bank that was working with them said, we've taken this as far as we can go. We have a resource that might be useful for you. And they ended up working with me for about 3 months, and we got to some really core issues, fundamental issues in terms of values, and looked at where they could come to a meeting of the minds, and both of their desires could be fulfilled in terms of what they wanted to have happen with the estate. They compromised so that they wasn't treated equally, but it was fair enough. And it was interesting how they did it. They did it by assessing what her financial wherewithal would have been if she hadn't quit her job to have the kids and raise them. And
Mhm.
so they figured out it was like 1/6 of what his was. And so their two kids that they had together got a sixth more of the estate than the other two. And everybody was fine with it. And it was a fascinating solution that they came up with based on their values and what mattered to them. And then they explained it to the kids. We did a family meeting. I had a chance to talk to the kids first and help them understand what was happening. And it was great because one of the kids was able to talk about deep concerns they had about their dad's physical health. And they were never able to bring it up because he would always shut it down and didn't want to talk about it. But because I was there as this neutral third party, they were able to bring it up and have the what if conversations and really find out what his wishes were, and power, medical power of attorney, how they could support their stepmom. Really, it was phenomenal. And then the other thing was their stepmom was younger than he was. So she was kind of closer in age to the two older kids.
Okay.
And so they got this, and they had not done any lifetime planning. So even though the advisors had recommended they could give money during their lifetime, they were like, no, 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 it's just all going to happen second to die. So the older kids were like, oh, this is great to know. We have to really think about our kids' college educations and our retirement. And so good to know we can't expect anything. We expect our stepmom to live a long, healthy life. And so they were prepared. So it wasn't a shock. And they were able to come from this place of so grateful to know. And then the parents sat back and they were like, wait, what? We could help with the grandkids' education. So all of a sudden, lifetime giving started happening because they were willing to have this conversation together.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's so, I mean, what a gift for that family.
yeah.
Because that's where and this is exactly kind of I think one of my main points is that the estate plan is really kind of a starting place, and I love that you're anyways one of those few people like sitting down and having these conversations and supporting families with family meetings, because downstream, it's a night and day difference. I mean, this could look like they never had the conversation. Maybe they signed documents, and then, downstream, maybe years, decades later, it could easily wind up in court with, even just that 1/6, like, two of the kids get more than the other. I mean, those scenarios do happen where, people can get paranoid and think there was undue influence or this isn't fair, and, their estate being litigated. So, I mean, there were so many examples in that story. So thanks for painting that picture.
Oh yeah, you're right. And it's an amazing thing what happens with the human brain. Like when we don't have information and those conversations don't happen, and they don't, or they don't go well, or there's like, well, Dad said it was all we wanted to be equal like 20 years ago. Like there could be some sort of like memory
Yeah.
that we always fill that void with the worst case scenario. It's just the way we're wired. And so yet in order to mitigate that, you really do need to make sure that the actual case is there, right? So like I'm always a strong proponent of like the letter of wishes, or some people call it
Yeah.
something where you actually write down What was your thought process that had you decide to set it up the way you did? Because memories change. People who even made the decision, I don't remember why. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Well, if you write it down, you can go back and see, oh, that's why we thought about it that way.
I love that. And I think so often people kind of assume, this is kind of included or should be part of the estate plan, or this will all work itself out, after we're gone. I'm dead. I'm not going to worry about it. But
Mhm.
it really, can, I mean, we've seen those horror examples. And I think, as much as it can be very costly, the saddest thing is families torn apart and relationships never being able to be rebuilt. So I think that's where, partnering with professionals like you and really giving this thought and time and a good amount of love and intention, it makes a world of difference. So I applaud you and your willingness. I don't sit down for family meetings, but it's nice to know professionals like you that do that.
When you start working as a trustee, like what the other thing that I do is beneficiary basics, like really helping them understand the role of being a beneficiary. Do you have like a process that you walk them through so they understand like what does it mean to have a trustee and a trust and like to be a beneficiary? Like
Yeah, I usually go through that. That would be like once, the client is, deceased and their trusts are funded. And so I have a whole onboarding process there. And also I think it's good to set the expectation of like what it's like to work with a professional trustee. But when I work with clients in the planning phase, I'm typically not meeting with the beneficiary, which is typically the children. I'm working alongside the clients, but I am gathering and asking all of these questions up front and really, beginning to have these conversations so that, when I am executing, the estate plan, whether I'm only acting as trustee and sometimes I'm kind of all of it, also a healthcare decision maker, I really feel confident in knowing what they want. And really working with clients proactively in the planning phase is what's inspired me to start this podcast and do this work, because I see time and time again, I would have prospects sitting down with me and they're like only thinking about, after death and like, oh, we just need a successor trustee. And I'm like, okay, well, what about your durable power of attorney? What about your healthcare decision making? And, for a married couple, they're thinking, okay, well, that's my spouse. Well, what about the surviving spouse? And even that next step, I'm finding it seems like about half of people aren't even thinking that far. And my assumption was always, oh, this is what your attorney is talking to you about, but it's not. So that's where I think also as professionals, the more that we really sit more, I think also in this place of authority and the ability to teach and educate more, because there's just a huge gap. I mean, 1 in 3 people have an estate plan, and even there, the people that have estate plans, I really question how are really well thought out, how many are really intentional. I think most people are just, for those that have it, are checking it off the box. And that's also where we see like, proxies being named in documents, and a lot of them don't even know that they're named in their documents as a healthcare decision maker or successor trustee. And then is that person even appropriate? I have like, there's a lot of people where they'll name like their older extended family members, and it's like, well, you're most likely going to outlive them. So, anyways, so all of this, I applaud you for working with clients in this way. So, I do want to ask you, because just to clarify, you have worked within a family office at one point.
I've worked in a couple of multifamily offices. I've worked for a couple of consulting firms as a contracted consultant, or I was managing partner of a boutique firm. And then I worked at multifamily office at US Bank called Ascent, and then also at PNC Private Bank Hawthorne in their ultra high net worth division. And I headed up their Institute for Family Success. So I've had a number of different hats in this arena for 20 years. And most recently opened up my own consulting practice to do this work, continuing to do the same work with families.
And just kind of thinking things through, I'm like, if you're working within a multifamily office, I'm assuming that, you're dealing with ultra high net worth individuals, where maybe now that you're working solo, you don't have that same requirement or threshold, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's where like working with those individuals when they're having those traumatic life events and helping them move through them, or a major transition that's happening, or also like somebody who's had a major windfall and they're looking at like what's next now that I don't have to work. I really love working with those people and helping them like come from a place of purpose and impact, and like what is it that, when you have enough that you can do anything, like what does that actually look like that's
Uh,
fulfilling for you?
yeah, right. Well, do you mind just defining what a family office
Mhm.
is? Because I think that there's so much kind of wealth and you kind of like looking under the hood. And I think a lot with my, being a professional fiduciary, I've seen where the profession, I think we could learn a lot from a family office. And I think there's probably a lot of parallels and kind of standards that we do that are similar. So I'd love to narrow down and focus on that area a little more. But let's first start off with just defining what a family office is.
Yeah, and there might be different definitions out there. From my experience, when a family reaches a place where they have significant assets, financially in terms of investments, real estate, a lot of complexity to what they own, it becomes quite important to have a way to manage it. And what can often happen is a family that has had a really successful family business has run a lot of things through the business that is actually more oriented towards the
Mm-hmm.
family. And when they have a liquidity event, like they sell the business or something's happened where they're no longer as involved in it, they need a way to continue to manage the family part of the business. So that often will be a catalyst to doing it, or it might be some people that have been part of a startup that got purchased and there's a big liquidity event and all of a sudden they have this huge windfall of money and they want to start a foundation and they want to own multiple properties and they also want to be tracking their investments and having it have social impact. And so they want to have a lot of say and control about all of that. So they want to have it all in-house. Typically, when you have maybe upwards of 50 million, likely 100 million, it makes sense to have your own family office because you have to staff it and you have to staff it with really good talent. You're going to want the best people you can get. And it costs quite a bit of money to run your own. So that's a single family office. But people who have a estate of 50 million, they might want to use a multifamily office where they're having like expertise within an institution. It could be a registered investment
Mm-hmm.
advisory firm or a bank, or they might want to think about having some things at the bank, like they do their borrowing and they have their mortgages, but then they want to have a different firm run their actual family office place. Like people have different desires. Some people like it really simple and have everything in one place. Some like to have it diversified because they don't want conflict of interest in their minds. There's so many different options now. If you have the complexity, it's like, I don't have the time or energy to manage all of this. And I also don't want to be having to manage a staff. So I'm going to outsource it and have a multifamily office handle our investments for us and handle it could go anywhere from the
I
insurance,
think
the
really
investments,
tax, right?
the,
Wanting like the investment, like a certain tax efficiency and tax planning and preserving wealth is, I think, a big piece because once you have 50 plus million, the plan is for this to stay in not just, one or two generations. We're thinking much larger. And for me, being a bit of a planner, that's where I
yeah.
always just get interested of thinking in that way.
Yeah, it's having that longer rhythm. I love the vision of like
Mm.
7 generations, right? Like we have the capacity here to have a true legacy and impact in the world, in our lives, in our family's life, and the lives of the people we care about in our communities. So having that strategic plan can be so powerful. And then having a group of advisors that really understand how to execute it can be so helpful. Yeah. So that's why people utilize it. There's a lot of buzzwords about family offices right now. And so I always encourage people, like, if they're like, wait, do we need a family? Like, do your research and find out what's out there. And then really look at what's the right mechanism for you, right? And the other thing I'll say is some people are like, well, we want to be philanthropic, so we need a foundation. There's all kinds of options for how to have an impact that don't involve having to have a foundation, which is, again, there's administration that's
Yeah.
involved in that, and there's requirements, and there's a way in which it gets publicly known. And You can have a donor advised fund with, very clear mission, vision, and purpose, just like you would for a foundation, but you can work with a community foundation or you can work with your financial
There's
institution. And
charitable
there's
remainder
all kinds of,
trusts.
yep, so many different ways. Yeah. And oh my gosh, there's so many different trusts. You can do a trust that gives to your favorite charity while you're alive. And then when you die, it goes to your kids. You can have it so it goes to your kids while you're alive. And then when you die, it goes to the charity. Like
Yeah.
there's so many different things you can do. And that's where having advisors that understand your goals, your purpose, what you want to have happen can help you structure it in the right way.
So
Yeah.
kind of working within, these multifamily offices, I'm assuming you work just kind of on staff and like available to families. Was it like as needed? Were things more proactive of like setting a family vision? I don't know if you can dive into what that kind of looked like.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it's so great because, I got to work with different teams across the country and really get it. And I worked with families that were
Wow.
international. And so it just depended on what the families needed. Sometimes it was like, we're really scared about telling our kids about the trust because we don't want them to be entitled and we don't want to rob them
Yeah.
of you know, they're making their way in the world. And they might have a few coaching conversations to understand how to go about it in a way that can be really empowering for the
Mhm.
children, and that there's ways to talk about the family wealth and the money without number signs and like actual digits, which because they're living in it anyway, like
Yeah.
they're not
Yeah.
under a rock. And oftentimes when you let them know that, their peers can figure out how much you're worth by going onto
Yeah.
the internet. Where do you want them to find it out from, And so that could be that simple, or it could be a whole family education program. So that's now as a fractional chief
Mhm.
learning officer, where I can work with the registered advisory firm, investment advisors, or the single family offices, where I can come in and kind of do this in a way when it's needed. I was in-house, and so I was able to do it all the time, and we could design educational programming for a large family so that they really had a great sense of what they needed to understand about being a
Yeah.
beneficiary, what their roles were, how to be smart about money, right? Just so that there was a sense of understanding the language of money. So when you have your quarterly investment review, you actually understand what's happening, and building that sense of confidence and competence in terms of this whole space around money and being able to talk about it. That was a big part of my role for sure.
Wow. I I just love everything that you're doing.
I don't know how much you've encountered this, but I wrote my little book on the beginner's guide to purposeful prenups
Oh,
because,
I'm so glad you brought that up because that's what I wanted. I was like, I have to, well, you're here. We have to talk about, prenups and also I think it's like love and money and relationships. And that, I is such a source of tension for most.
oh my gosh. And I have to tell you, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of families, you know, household name families. And the most painful thing that I would hear in the interviews with the married in-laws is how they were treated as outlaws and how the prenup conversation was handled. And the pain and the resentment that was still there years later. And, there's not a lot I can do about the suffering in the
Yeah.
world, but that's like one area where I can actually help alleviate some pain and maybe bring more harmony that could actually have a ripple effect in some way, right? Because these families touch so many people's lives. And if you can remove something that causes a lot of resentment and hurt and, distrust and anger, you're going to have a much more harmonious and fulfilling way of relating with, your loved ones, with the people you work with, your employees, your staff. And so I wrote that it's a little tiny book. It's like smaller than a Reader's Digest, but it's all about how to have the conversation and start it off in a really great way so that you can strengthen your marriage and you can strengthen the family. And it's not an impossible thing. It's just, again, with that intentionality we talked about earlier. And it's so important to do it while you're in love and while you really care about each other. But when it's imposed on you and when you're told you have to do it and there's no context and it feels very personal, it's just so painful. So wanted to turn that around so that people got like, basically your state has your prenup set up for you. So do you want people that don't know you and have never met you before to determine your future? Or do you guys want to have a say in that? And how do you want your future to look? And it's not just divorce, it's death and disability. You can have all of those conversations.
Wow, what a gift. We'll definitely include links to that book in the show notes. So, other, expanding kind of beyond the prenup, but let's just talk about relationships and love. I actually have a few people in mind, listeners, and people in my personal life where actually one of the reasons why they haven't approached the estate plan is because, the spouses have separate finances and they're really operating, completely separate financially. And do you, for a couple like that, maybe it's a second or third marriage, there are children, much older, but they're out of the house, how would you even start? And maybe they know like, oh, we need to get an estate plan, but we don't even kind of talk about money.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I oftentimes, more often than not, the step families that I work with, the finances are separate, but they do tend to blend in some way. Like, and that it's always interesting to find out like who owns the
Yeah.
house or who pays the bills or how do you go about, like I meet them where they are and I find out where they are able to talk about money and financial decisions. Trips they're taking, gifts that they're getting for the holidays, or how to, and just find out where there is any kind of overlap, where they might be talking about it or bringing funds together. And then talk about what historically brought them to this place that has them have it set up the way that they have it. And also, what stories or money experiences did they witness, hear, see growing up, or even in their adult lives related to estate
Mm,
plans? Anything that they remember, anything at all, and maybe what they wish had happened that didn't, or maybe something that they saw and interpreted a certain way, and they made certain decisions because of that. So you really just spending time, and there's no judgment, there's no right or wrong. It's really about like, what's your narrative about life when it comes to money and death and estates? Like, what does that look like? And I mean, I'll meet somebody on a plane, tell them what I do, and I'll hear the most like
yeah.
nightmare stories about how they're not taking care of their siblings anymore, or oh yeah, our family's been totally in this feud because it's, and it could be over like a vase. Like it doesn't even have to be like massive amounts of money, but because we don't have the ability to talk about it well, we just avoid it and then it
I've
just blows
had
up.
estates where it was the pile of vintage Barbies the sisters were fighting over, Yeah.
That's huge. Are you kidding? That's like, yeah, but there's really significant things that happen. Like I worked with one family where the grandmother left her ranch to all of her grandchildren, but there was no governance in place. There was no conversation about it. So the grandchildren were completely in the dark in terms of like, how do we do upkeep and maintenance? How do we use this property? Can we do any updates to it? And like half of them wanted to update it and modernize it, and the other half were like, we have to leave it exactly like how grandma had it. And it's without any direction, they had nowhere to go with it. And they were all stuck. And so it's like whatever you can do to support people who are going to be
Yeah.
co-owners or co-beneficiary or whatever way it is to be able to work through those things is so
So you said
important.
a word of governance. So this is kind of a language that I hear. Again, I don't serve in family offices at all. I find that, people where they're working with a professional fiduciary, it's usually somewhere around 1 to, 15 million is usually kind of the number that I'm hearing. I would think the largest estate that I've administered, it's been just over 10 million, just to give you a sense. So anyways, but with family offices, I hear this term kind of thrown around a lot of family governance, right? Is that, can you kind of,
Yeah.
it to me it makes sense, but I also make a lot of assumptions. So I'm like, I would love to know, how do you define that? And even just for families that, aren't in the, in a family office, I think there's probably a lot of wisdom that we could all use when we think and approach our legacies and planning proactively.
I'm so glad you asked that. I'm such a proponent for getting jargon out of vocabulary, the speaking about this. I'm so glad you
Yeah.
nailed it. Thank you. So basically, governance is just this big word for how do we make
Yeah.
decisions together and how do we coordinate actions together? So, and any family can do it. It doesn't, you might have a lake house, right? Like you don't have to have like bajillions of dollars, but just if you have something where multiple people within the family are using it, benefiting from it, or in some way needing to make
Mhm.
decisions about it. One of the things that is pretty common to start with is to get clear on what the family's values are related to what's the purpose of why we have it, whether it's the lake house or the donor advised fund or the trusts or the investments that we have or the vintage Barbies. Like, what's the purpose of these things? Why do we have them? And then from there, you look at, well, if we understand the values behind that and the why behind it. I love, Simon Sinek start with the why. Like, why does this matter to us? I'm really digging into that. Then you can also look at what are the concerns that you have for the future? Like, I don't want the grandkids to be entitled, or I don't want them to be spoiled brats, or I want everybody to benefit from the money, but I don't want them to not do anything. And then you find out like what's the value underneath that? Is it a work ethic? Is it contribution? Is it to whom much is given, much is required? Like what are the different idioms or stories or values that brought you to this point where this is an important thing that really matters to you? And then from there, you build like, what's our purpose statement, our mission statement, if you will. One thing I like to do with step families that bring me in when they're really wanting to look at how do we blend? How do we make this be a real family of affinity? We'll create a code of honor, their own coat of arms, and they'll have their family motto, and they'll have the images that matter to them that capture their values, and they'll actually create something that's meaningful for them that really captures what it means to be a family that looks like this. And then from there, you can look at, okay, well, this is who we are. So how do we want to be with each other when we have conflict, when we have differences of opinion? So you can create a code of conduct. Like we have a code that we treat each other respectfully. And if at any point somebody doesn't feel they're being respected, they get to call a timeout or they get to request a different time to have the conversation. Or so you actually operationalize it. Like if respect is a really important thing, well, what does that look like in the midst of an argument or a disagreement? And then also it could be things like in families where maybe there's a business, how do you employ family members? What's the family employment policy? And how do you pay them? Like, what does that look like? And making sure that that's transparent so that the family understands what the person's doing to be qualified to be in that role, how their performance is being assessed, and why they're getting the bonuses that they are, as opposed to being a family member that's not in the business, not getting any distributions from the business because you're being told all the distributions have to go back into the business or dividends, however it's set up. But you keep seeing your sibling who's working in the business renovating their home, getting a new car, going on all these trips. And it's like, wait a second. And so, because again, that worst case scenario, that you need to really understand what is it that allows somebody to get these perks when you're not getting any financial benefits from it. So those kinds of structures in place really help with family cohesion for the
Oh,
long term.
thanks for teasing that out for us because that really helps and it makes so much sense. I mean, even when I'm meeting, with clients proactively, I'm working less so with family businesses, but I guess more so with real estate when I see a lot of real estate. And that's what I really like to ask, clients, like, do you have a preference? Like, do you want everything liquidated when you die? Do you want to pass one property to one child and, another to another child? And that's again where I'm seeing that this kind of next step of having these conversations of teasing things out. What is your vision? What's your intention? And sometimes it's totally like I have no care in the world, just sell it all and distribute the funds to to our children. But most of the time there is kind of some kind of intention.
And that's a really important one too, because if there is real estate, it's so important to find out what the expectations are of the children and what's the history too, like any stories behind these
Yes.
buildings, or were there some kids that were more involved at the time when it was purchased or the utilization of it, and really giving that space for that and capturing those stories makes such a difference for the family, especially if there is a plan to liquidate when they pass away.
Yeah, well said. Well, Emily, I can tell that we could talk all day. I would love to have you back and just pick your brain about so many we could go deep on each subject we touched upon today. So I just really want to thank you for coming on the podcast and speaking with me. I've learned a lot from our conversation. As we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to leave listeners with?
Oh gosh, I think no matter what you have in terms of your estate, quote unquote, the best thing you can do for yourself and your family is to create an estate plan. And it can be really simple. It doesn't have to be very complex. But not having one, it just creates such a difficult time for people when
Yeah.
they're grieving. That's one. And then the other is if you are using a trustee, write down your letter of wishes. And I'll say my favorite book to help you with that is called The Wealth of Your Life by Susan Turnbull. And it's a workbook and it just asks questions, very simple. And if you sit down individually, as a couple, whatever it is for you, and just take the time to answer those questions and write them down, it's such a gift for your family and for the
Oh,
trustee.
wonderful. We'll include links to that. I don't know that one, so I'll have to pick up a copy myself.
Oh yeah, that's going to be a good one for
Oh,
you to have
oh,
as you're working.
wonderful. Well, thank you again, Emily. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. I know you will.
Thank you. It was great.